Welcome to Write Now Workshop Podcast, where you can write a book and change the world. I'm your host, Kitty Bucholtz, and this is episode 203, History and the Art of Storytelling, an interview with Jeremy Dronfield, coming to you on Thursday, July 2nd, 2020. So how is your writing going? Are you getting a lot done? Do you feel like the weird life schedule that we've been having has been giving you some opportunities to do a little bit more writing? I hope so. I've been getting a little bit more done on Love at the Clip and Curl, which is book 2 following Love at the Fluff and Fold, my last book that came out. And I have to say, it's going pretty well, except that this book covers a much longer period of time. It's 1 year. And a lot of things happen in 1 year of a person's life and 1 year of a cute small town life. So, I need to spend a little bit more time and figure out what is actually going in the story and what is not going in the story. And then I'm sure I will get a lot more and faster and better writing done, and words that are probably, going to stay in the story as opposed to just writing for the fun of it. Writing for fun is good, but I would like to write words that are actually going to be in the book. So that's what I'm working on, Love at the Clip and Curl, and also still working on the edits for the encouragement. I'm like, what should I call it? Encouraging words for writers, encouragement for writers. I obviously don't exactly know what the book title is yet, but I'm working on the edits for that book and still working on the book title. If you get to the end of the summer and you think back and go, wow, okay, I really thought I would get more writing done. I meant to get more writing done. Consider joining my coaching program, Finish Your Book. It just started with the group actually this week, Monday of this week. We started the first class of it. It's an 8-week intensive that's both group coaching and individual coaching. And it's all about figuring out what your goal is during this 8-week period and how we can get you to finish your book or to get closer to finish your book. Or if necessary, one of my students, he's starting his next book. So if you find that you get to the end of the summer and you didn't quite get done what you meant to get done, consider joining my next Finish Your Book program that will be in September. I am also co-hosting a webinar with my friend Jennifer Dornbush called Writing with Hollywood in Mind. It's a free webinar. We actually had one last night my time, yesterday morning your time probably, depending on where you live. It was on July 1st, but we're having another one on Saturday, July 18th. And so it's totally free. Me and Jennifer are giving you information that could be helpful for you writing your next script or your next novel, how you can take things that are in current movies in the current system and make your stuff work even better so that it stands out more. So you can sign up for that free webinar at writenowworkshop.com/July 25. And if you're thinking, wait, I thought you said the webinar was on July 18th. It is. And the reason why the URL is July 25 is because the webinars are leading up to the one-day conference, Writing with Hollywood in Mind, that Jennifer and I will be hosting along with agent Julie Gwynn from the Seymour Agency. So lots more information on the website. And also just remember it's summer schedule, so 2 weeks in between episodes during the summer instead of having one every week, except for Encouraging Words episodes, which still happen the first Sunday of the month. So in a few days, you'll have your next Encouraging Words episode, and then a week and a half later, your next interview. I hope that you are getting lots of great stuff done this summer, regardless of how much you are or aren't having to stay in. I'm doing a lot of staying in, running out through a couple of fields for my half marathon training, just in case the half marathon happens. I'll be ready. If it doesn't happen, I'm running 13 miles that day anyway. So I hope you're getting some exercise, getting some writing done, finding some ways to add more joy and peace into your life. Meanwhile, this episode is going to be very intriguing, I think, for you. Jeremy writes nonfiction. The book that we're talking about is The Boy Who Followed His Father into Auschwitz. Sorry that I can't say that quite right. And it is heartbreaking. But I have to say that the entire time that I'm reading it, I'm like, holy cow, like the storytelling in this Even when it's stark, I can't stop reading it. So I think that you're really going to enjoy this interview, regardless of whether you write fiction or nonfiction. There's a lot of things in here that are really useful for writers. So here we are with our interview with Jeremy. Today's guest is Jeremy Dronfield. Jeremy is a biographer, historian, novelist, and former archaeologist. His recent nonfiction titles include Dr. James Barrie, A Woman Ahead of Her Time, a Sunday Times Book of the Year. He lives in England. Welcome, Jeremy.
Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. This is exciting for me because somebody who's like just a 1 hour trip away instead of on the other side of the world. So you have so many interesting job titles in your biography, but I was reading it and I was thinking, honestly, it seems like you've done multiple versions of the same thing, like biographer, historian, archaeologist. It's a lot of searching and digging and looking for something.
Yeah, they're all kind of related. I've had a kind of a pattern of turning hobbies into careers. That's really how it's progressed from one thing to another. I mean,
Nice.
I started writing fiction when I was supposed to be writing archaeology. So that's how I progressed to that.
Interesting.
And then I graduated then to ghostwriting and nonfiction when I was supposed to be doing fiction. And they all follow in quite a haphazard way. I mean, I suppose you're finding some logic in there, but it never seems logical at the time.
Right. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who are listening to us right now who are thinking, oh, so maybe my obsession with the bright, shiny other thing isn't always a bad thing.
No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it didn't always come easy. I mean, after I did my PhD in archaeology, I mean, my first experience of writing for publication was publishing my research as a series of academic papers. Then I spent 3 years struggling, to establish an academic career in archaeology, but it was so chronically underfunded.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, I was supposed to be writing a book about art and religion in prehistoric Europe, but I ended up writing a novel instead. I mean, it took several attempts. I mean, I wrote about a third of a novel that was set in the world of archaeology. Then I managed to finish a manuscript on a completely different subject, completely different topic. And there was also a work of fiction, and I couldn't get anywhere with that. I didn't manage to get an agent, but I got close enough for it to be encouraging. So I wrote another novel, and then that finally got me an agent and a publishing deal, and got me on my way.
Yeah. So was novel writing something that had been in the back of your head as a youth?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those kids that was quite advanced in writing when I was really little, but then didn't really do it. I didn't read a lot when I was a kid, really. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I started really doing something with it, and first started making attempts to write little bits and pieces of fiction. It was doing kind of in an odd way doing my PhD that enabled me to write novels, because that was my first experience of writing something really book length.
Oh, right.
Which I had never really felt I could do before that.
Yeah.
So putting together that impulse to write stories, to write fiction, together with the experience of having written something at length and having seen my work published.
Yeah.
And also there was this kind of wonderful liberty with writing fiction after being in the academic world, that I could just make stuff up.
Yeah.
I didn't have to be meticulous about my sources and citations and getting everything absolutely tied up perfectly. I could just make stuff up.
Yeah.
But then I've kind of come full circle back now that I'm writing historical nonfiction, or I'm using my impulses as a narrative writer, a storyteller, with the rigor that I learned as an academic. The two have come together.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, so the book that we're talking about is, it's your latest book, right? You don't have another book that's been out since.
No, this is my most recent. Yeah.
Okay. So it's what I've been reading, The Boy Who Followed His Father into Auschwitz, which is heartbreaking. It's taking me so long to get through it just because there's a limit to how much time I can spend consuming this horrible this, I mean, there's a lot of hope and interesting things where I'm just like, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything for readers. Let me just say it's incredibly interesting. And on the one hand, I can't stop reading. And there's been a couple of times when I've been like almost late to something because I was like, oh crap, I just meant to read until I, had this next appointment. And there are times when I'm like, oh, I hope, this person or that person actually ends up with a happy ending because right this minute, like things aren't too bad for them. But also it's, so basically, let me just stop by saying it kind of leaves me speechless. I can't even imagine the amount of research that you had to read of all of these real life incidents in order to create this book. And it's not a short book. Do you want to kind of take it from whichever direction is most interesting for you? You've probably done a lot of interviews already on it.
Well, basically the stories of a father and son who were sent together to concentration camps in 1939, Gustav Kleinman and his teenage son Fritz. And in 1942, after surviving amazingly 3 years in Bucholtz concentration camp, Gustav was transferred to Auschwitz, scheduled to be transferred to Auschwitz. And as soon as he found out about this, Fritz, his son, volunteered to go with him, even though they knew it was a virtually certain death sentence. I mean, that was the central moment that gives the book its title, and it was what really made me want to tell this story. It first came to me, it's an entirely true story, and the core of it was where I first heard of this story was Gustav kept a diary throughout his time in the camps for over 5 years. He wrote his first entry in it on October the 2nd, 1939, his first day in Buchenwald. And then his last entries were written in the summer of 1945, when he was on his way back across Europe, back to Vienna, his home. And as well as being a writer, I also do publishing consulting. I help other authors prepare their books to attract publishers. And I was asked to help find a publisher for just an English translation of basically Gustav's diary, plus a commentary written by Fritz, which had been published before in German in Austria. And we couldn't get a publisher no matter what I did with it, because however fantastically important it is as a document, and however amazing the story it tells, Gustav's diary is incredibly difficult to read. He never really wrote it in order to be read. He mainly read it just to keep a grip on his own sanity. That seems to be the reason. So it's very difficult to follow. He wrote it very sketchily. It's full of very abstract references to people and places and events. So even a Holocaust historian wouldn't be able to follow it without constantly consulting their reference works. And really, that was the foundation of my research, was pairing apart every sentence in that diary, working out what he was referring to, who he was referring to, assigning dates to things. He didn't always put dates on entries. So that was the backbone of my research, and piecing this all together, working out what it all meant, was really the core of the book. The rest of my research was, so Fritz, who died in 2009, left behind a short memoir, about 20,000 words, which was meant to help illuminate his father's diary. He also gave quite a few interviews, Fritz, during his lifetime. I tracked those down. And there was a lot of archive research, book research, but the most important thing was I managed to track down the last surviving member of the Kleinman family. There were 6 of them altogether, Gustav and his wife Tini, back before the Nazis came to Vienna. It was Gustav and his wife Tinny, and they had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And the youngest child, Kurt, who was 8 when the Nazis came to Vienna, at 11 years old, his mother managed to get him sent to America to a family in Massachusetts. And so he survived the Holocaust and is still alive and well in America. He just turned 90 this year.
Wow.
So I managed to trace him, and it took a while to gain his trust. I mean, he didn't know who on earth I was. And I spent hours and hours talking to him, interviewing him about what he remembered of life, of the family's life in Vienna before Hitler came, as he puts it.
Yeah.
What kind of man his father was, what kind of person his brother Fritz was, the things that held them together. And then I discovered that Kurt's story itself was worth telling. And as I pieced it all together, I realized that this was as much a story about a family. Because at its heart, Fritz's decision to follow his father to Auschwitz came partly from a feeling of dread and despair of losing all that was left to him of his family at that point. And at its core, it's a story of Gustav's wife, Tini, Fritz's mother, trying desperately to save her children. And she only really managed to save 2, her eldest daughter, who managed to get to England before the war started, and Kurt to America. And from being a story about a father and son in the camps, it became also a story about the whole family and what happened to them.
Yeah.
I mean, Kurt's story in itself was astonishing. He was there. I mean, one of the things that he remembers most vividly is the night the Nazis came for his father and brother, and his father being taken away. And he has curious gaps in his memory that trauma has taken away his memories.
Yeah.
But that was the final piece that helped me put together this book and made me understand the family.
Yeah.
It was a big research project. I reckon it was about 2 years of preliminary research and preparation, and about a year of full-time research and writing. Yeah, it was a big project.
And so you were talking about how somebody had been asking you to help. How can we get this diary translated into English? And that wasn't working. Did you pitch the project and get a go ahead before you started, or at what point did you get a publisher behind you?
Well, oh god, that was an ordeal in itself. I having failed to get a publisher for the translated diary, I decided that because of the reason being it was so difficult to read, I decided the best way I could tell this story would be to bring my abilities as a writer and a researcher to it and tell it in a way that would be completely accessible to anyone.
Right.
So I put together a book proposal. This was during the preparation of this proposal when I tracked down Kurt and did a fair amount of the initial research. So it was just standard proposal, a pitch and the overall chapter by chapter synopsis and a couple of sample chapters.
Yeah.
And we had no more luck getting a publisher for that than for the diary. The reaction from everyone, in publishers in the UK and the US, was fantastic story, but there's no market for this. There's no market for Holocaust. But this was before the Tattooist of Auschwitz became successful. So it was believed that there was just simply no market for books about the Holocaust at that point. It only managed to get completed when a very small indie press in Chicago picked it up. And then I believe the only reason they picked it up was because the commissioning editor there was the child of Holocaust survivors, and it had a kind of a personal, and if I remember right, there were parallels between his family's story and the Kleinman story. And I think it had a personal resonance for him.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they were a tiny indie press, and there wasn't a huge amount they could do in terms of making the book really reach a big audience.
Yeah.
And I thought it was just going to sink into obscurity at that point.
So they just bought North American rights then?
Yeah. I mean, what they were able to offer for it at the beginning was so little. I mean, I'm a professional writer. This is how I make my living. This is how I pay my bills. I mean, I couldn't afford to do the book, really, at that point. They were offering so little. But by that point, I'd got to know Kurt so well. And I felt I had this moral obligation to him and to the story to write it. So I just got on and did it. And
wow.
it just took it on the chin. And then, then I think I felt it seemed like it was going to slide into obscurity. But then this really visionary commissioning editor at Penguin in the UK just decided of his own back that he wanted to do a really good Holocaust book. And he knew my agent very well and looked at what was then, the title of the book then was The Stone Crusher.
Okay.
And he decided that was the book he wanted to do. And he and Penguin managed to make it a #1 bestseller here in the UK.
Wow.
And it has since been picked up by HarperCollins in the US, and it's just been released in the US a couple of weeks ago, and it is already reaching within the first week, it reached a bigger audience than the original edition managed to do in a whole year.
Right.
So so finally for Kurt, because this has been enormously important for Kurt as the last member of the family, that it reached the biggest audience possible, because he's, as far as he's been able to do, he's been telling his story publicly for years and years, and this has enabled it to reach the kind of audience he wants it to, large scale.
I don't know. I started on your website and then I went to another one and maybe another one. I think I might have accidentally clicked through to 3 websites, and I noticed, number 4 on the bestseller list in Canada. And then I started noticing the dates. So the book has been just like this. I mean, it's been a bestseller and it's been doing amazing, but it's also, taken months. And I don't even know when the first date from the Chicago publisher was, but this has been, I don't know, would you call it a slow growth? It seems like in traditional publishing, maybe they would consider this a slow term of growth, but it's been amazing.
Yeah, well, in terms of getting it actually placed with the publisher, that was slow. But once it was out, I mean, when they published in the UK, Penguin, and Kurt came over and we did TV, radio, and it went into the Sunday Times bestseller list immediately. It was an instant success. Yeah, the day that it was published, it went to #1 on Amazon's bestsellers, and it went into the bestseller chart on the strength. I think it was like its first 2 days of sales. Yeah, I mean that was how good a job Penguin did with it.
Yeah,
and it was kind of off the strength off the back of that HarperCollins took it for North America.
Yeah,
it was partly a slow process because, of course, there was the issue of the rights with the previous publisher.
right.
There was a lot of legal stuff that had to be sorted out. So that was really the reason for the slowness there. Yeah, but it's where it's been known about, it's been this enormous instant success, because it is such, the things what appeals to people about it is exactly what appealed to me, that made me want to write it. This incredibly powerful, moving story of this father and son. And it's, as you say, it's a very harrowing story, but ultimately I feel it's uplifting. It's a story about love and hope and courage.
Yeah, I have to say, it's definitely, I don't read a ton of of narrative nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction, not a lot of narrative nonfiction, but this is definitely like on the top of my list for narrative nonfiction that I've read in the last few years. You just, you're so consumed with what's happening to these individuals and the families, and you have the historical perspective and the personal, and there's something about your style that makes me sort of forget that I'm reading, and I feel like I'm watching this happen to them, and I'm so angry at what's happening to them, and I'm also just amazed and thinking, like, at least a couple times a chapter I'm asking myself, could I have done this? Could I have managed this and this and this? And Teeny just, wow. I mean, she's like, I don't, obviously this is one of those books that I do have a hard time like thinking of, like, what are the words that I'm trying to say? But like, as a mother, she is that creature who is doing everything she can to protect and take care of her family in a way that most mothers will thankfully never have to even come close to. It's just amazing.
Yeah. And what you say about you feel you're watching it is exactly what I try to achieve when I write a story. I mean, I think and write visually. I think in terms of the reason my books flow the way they do is that I think in terms of scenes more than chapters. Great. And everything I'm seeing everything in my head as I'm working, and everything I write is a desperate attempt to actually present that visually. I'm trying to make a film, I think, in my head when I'm writing.
Yeah.
And it seems to work.
And is this something that you found is a normal part of your nonfiction, and also is it a normal part of just all of your writing, fiction and nonfiction?
It's everything narrative that I write. It's not a conscious decision. It's not a conscious attempt to let's try and do this with what I'm writing. It's just I gradually realized that that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
I was seeing things and trying to make the reader see what I'm seeing, and it has this effect. It seems to work. As I say, it does seem to have that effect.
It's definitely working for me. I want to look into your other books.
I don't really know why it works. I absolutely couldn't tell you why it works. Just that's what I'm trying to do, and that's the outcome.
Yeah. Well, that's funny, because that was kind of a segue into the next thing I was going to ask you about. In addition to writing, you have been a reader for a literary agency, a ghostwriter, and a book doctor. So you've seen stories that are having trouble, and you've seen stories that have overcome their troubles to be amazing, I'm sure. What are some of the things that you suggest to authors when they're struggling? I mean, this is a big project, so on any of your books, like, what are some of the things that you learned that you can put into words as helpful tips for others?
I'm not sure, because it always depends entirely on the exact book proposal. It's more about seeing patterns of mistakes that authors make, trying to overwrite things, underwrite things.
Yeah.
That's an important pattern you see again, you keep recurring, is that you see authors that just don't give you enough, and then authors that give you far too much. A lot of the reading work I do is more around authors who are mostly already fairly experienced. Often they're people who've already had books published, and often I'm advising them more about the way they present this stuff than about how they actually write them, and getting a balance of, in terms of how they write them, getting a balance with non-narrative nonfiction, getting a balance of historical background, context, narrative setting the story in a scene. If people are able to do that, it helps get a reader's attention, setting a narrative within a scene, physicalizing things, visualizing it.
Yeah. Like the
making
portion that,
making the reader feel the place,
yeah,
but then not overdoing that, knowing how this is something that you can only really learn by experience, by doing it over and over again, and by reading lots and lots and lots of manuscripts that aren't working,
right,
other
right.
people's work, working out where that balance is between getting the visual intensity, the immersive quality of the narrative right, and overdoing it.
Yeah.
And
just to give listeners an example, I just happened to be reading this section right before you and I got on this call to start talking, and you were describing spring coming to the camp, and it probably was 3, maybe 4 sentences, not long ones, and I saw the greening of the trees, all the leaves coming out, and then you compared the songs of 2 different birds. And then the not axes, saws cutting through the trees and the trees falling. And that was all it took for me to know exactly when and where we were. I mean, of course, I know where we are, but at that moment, I hadn't been out in the woods with them yet. So I'm in my mind seeing these beautiful woods being, struck down so that the wood can be used for terrible purposes. But anyway, I also really saw that it was spring. I heard that it was spring. Maybe one of the only things that I didn't was smell, but in my mind, I grew up in the woods and I could kind of smell that green, fresh wood smell. And it wasn't more than a couple of sentences. So I only bring this up because listeners might be wondering, well, how do I know if I'm over or underwriting? Sometimes it's just enough, right?
yeah, that moment actually came from that. There's just a very brief glimpse in Gustav's diary that comes from, that he mentions how nice it was to be out, cutting trees out in the forest, and it was spring was coming. Yeah, my natural inclination is to overwrite. I'm going back to my first attempts at full-length fiction. I overwrote really badly. I tried, it was this visualization thing, and I was trying to get every last detail of a picture onto the page. So I really badly, really awfully overwrote scenes. And I experienced that thing that we all have of being reluctant to cut stuff out.
Yeah.
And gradually learn. I mean, so many writers say this, the process of gradually learning to cut out things that you think are good. And for me, I think I've only really very recently, finally, I think, managed to perfect the ability to do that after a 20-year career. I think it's only now that I'm really starting to get it properly right. Knowing, judging that, how many words to use and how many details, what are the most telling details that you can use to convey that feeling of that scene, and to learn. I've got to the point now where I can read through my own draft and just immediately strike things out that are too much. As I say, it's taken me 20 years of experience, and not just writing experience. I couldn't have got where I am as a writer without the literally thousands of manuscripts and book proposals that I've appraised over the past decade.
Wow.
I'd like with all of that, I'm including the really, really terrible ones. I always learn something from looking at those and appraising them and seeing what people had got wrong, because however bad those manuscripts were, there was usually something that author had done that I had a tendency to do as well.
Right.
And
yeah.
I learned to look out for it in myself.
That sounds like a fabulous reason to, I suppose it's not an easy job to get, but it certainly seems like a great way to get need, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but I'm thinking in my head, a free education.
Well, yeah, yeah. Quite a painful one as well, though. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But then over time, you've found ways to be helpful to other writers. So if I'm reading your website right, some of the books that you've written were actually started by someone else, and then you came along to help co-write and make it into a publishable book.
Yeah. Again, that was a bit of a sort of strange start. I'd reached a bad place in my career, and my partner suggested, this was actually after watching the Roman Polanski film, The Ghost, about with Ewan McGregor as a ghostwriter who's commissioned to write a ghost memoir of a character who's transparently based on Tony Blair. My partner suggested to me, why don't you become a ghostwriter? So I found an agent who handles ghostwriters, and I just did that. And I mean, I have done some anonymous ghosting, but some of the books that now have my name on them started out as ghost projects. There would be, somebody would have researched people who didn't really have a background as writers, not even necessarily as amateur writers, but who had got involved in a subject because they were just fascinated by it, and they couldn't make it work as a book. They put the story together. So, I mean, the example is one you mentioned, Dr. James Barry, A Woman Ahead of Her Time, which is the story of a 19th century woman who became a man in order to study medicine and ended up having a decades-long career as a surgeon in the British Army.
Wow.
Died in 1865, lived as a man for over 40 years. And the secret was discovered after Dr. Barry died.
Wow.
But anyway, my co-author on that, Michael Dupre, who sadly is no longer with us, was himself. He was a retired surgeon himself and had become fascinated with the story of James Barry and had spent 12 years researching it. But he didn't have a background as a writer, and he couldn't make it work as a book. So I was brought in as a ghostwriter I was supposed to just take Michael's manuscript and rewrite it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I made another discovery while doing this, and some of the other books that I worked on at the same time that I came to in a similar way, was that with all respect to Michael, people who aren't able to write a book are also have shortcomings with researching them. Because this was something that was new to me. I learned doing these books that your ability, your instincts as a storyteller shape how you do the research. They inform the areas, what avenues are really worth pushing, really burrowing into that somebody else might overlook, and what areas are worth focusing on. And my background was academic, so I was a trained researcher as well. So I got so deeply involved in the research and the writing that it ended up as a co-authored book. And the same happened with several other books that I was working on at the same time, that I was originally started as intended as a ghost, but became a full co-author. Yeah. And it was a bit of a nightmare, actually, because I took on 4 of these projects at the same time.
Oh, wow.
All 4 of them very, complex, very different periods, different personalities, all historical biographies, all quite complex. I took on 4, did book proposals for 4 of them, all went out to publishers, because of my experience in publishing, I figured, well, if I do 4, then there's a reasonable chance that maybe 1 will get picked up.
Right, exactly.
And within a year, all 4 of them got placed with publishers. So then I had to write and do partial research on all 4 of these books in the space of 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I ended up making myself ill doing this.
Yeah.
I was just doing them back to back. Each one got more and more past its deadline. The first one was delivered to deadline. Next one was a few months, till eventually the 4th one was a year late.
Wow.
So that is something I would really not like to go through again.
Yeah. And yet the reason why you did it is totally logical. So I don't know if you feel like looking back, you have any advice on for people listening who might be, struggling to decide, well, do I send out more than one proposal for these nonfiction ideas that I have?
Yeah. The problem with I see submissions occasionally as a reader from people who are pitching several ideas, and the problem with that tends to be that none of the ideas is ever really properly developed. When I did these 4 proposals, because another person had already done the bulk of the research and sort of pieced together the story, I was able to do full detailed proposals for all 4 of them reasonably quickly. It was only after I'd done those really that I started getting really deeply involved. So if you've got multiple stories or multiple subjects that you think you might like to write a nonfiction book about, if you have the ear of an agent, if you have someone you can bounce this stuff off, then it's definitely worth pitching a number of different ideas to see which the agent thinks they might be able to sell. But if you don't have that, then I would really recommend focusing on the one that you really feel, the one that you really believe in the most.
Yeah.
And developing that fully. Unless you have the time and the inclination and the resources to develop them all as full book proposals. And some people can do book proposals very quickly. I don't know quite how they manage it, but some people do, but most don't. Most take a very long time. I've known, as a reader, I've known proposal projects take 2, maybe even 3 years to be developed to the point where they're actually ready for submission.
Wow.
Occasionally that happens, and it's been nice, on occasion to see those actually find publishers.
Yeah. So it's possible that while one's on submission, you can start preparing your next idea, but you may not even be able to get it fully prepared before you hear back on the first one. Even if I'm used to,
even if you're submitting through, even if you have an agent, you're submitting proposals, you could still have books can still be on submission for months and months before you really get anywhere.
Yeah.
It's a slow process, even if you've got an agent.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. If you had more than one idea anyway, it's a way that you can time things a little bit. It gives you something to do during the waiting period.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly you should definitely develop those ideas if you've got them.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah, but it's getting harder now. When I wouldn't like to be at the beginning of my career again now. When I first got out, I was submitting first as an amateur would-be novelist. I was submitting to agents in 1996 to 97.
Okay.
And at that point, you were still way ahead of the pack if you were submitting to agents rather than to direct publishers. Most people were still going on to the publisher's slush pile at that point. It was only the people who were forward thinking who went to agents, and agents weren't getting that many submissions. So I managed to get attention relatively a lot more easily than you would now. Now that most publishers won't take submissions direct from authors, and which with the result that agents are overrun with. My own agent gets thousands of submissions every week.
Yeah.
And I really wouldn't like to be doing that. My heart goes out to people who are in that situation now. But agents agents have this nose for something that's going to work, and they don't, even though they get thousands of submissions, they go through them at lightning speed because they know instantly whether something's something that will work. So it is worth persevering.
Yeah. Yeah, you still hear stories about people who were plucked off the slush pile. So,
Yeah, I mean, when I'm giving advice about book proposals, I mean, the way our agency formats them is to begin with a one-page opening pitch, just a few paragraphs of prose and a few bullet points giving unique selling points. And I usually know within the first few lines of somebody's opening pitch whether this is something exciting. And that's where I always focus my advice, is on getting that first page of the proposal exactly right, because 99.9% of proposals are probably set aside if that isn't any good. They're not going to carry on reading after that opening pitch if it doesn't grab them.
So if a writer might be thinking, well, I'm maybe not so good at the pitch, the proposal part, but when they read my chapters, then they'll see the genius. They might not ever get read.
They're fairly, unless it's a subject that the publisher is looking for. But then there's likely to be another proposal from somebody else on a similar subject that may fill that gap.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, when you're absolutely deluged with submissions, then you do get into the habit of judging something on the basis of those opening paragraphs, and it is so important to get that right. And you have to get, and the mistakes that people make are the ones I see most frequently are trying to explain the story in too much detail, starting from the wrong place, failing to work out, or failing to have the experience, not having the experience to know what aspect of the story to lead with, putting in too much detail, not being coherent, just giving points that the book includes. And
yeah,
there are so many ways to go wrong with that opening page, and it is the most important to get right. It's also extremely important to get the rest of the proposal right, but if you can't, that first page has to be spot on.
Yeah. It seems to me that writing is a lot like a lot of other entrepreneurial businesses. You can have a great idea, but if you can't present the business plan to the person who can help you move forward, your great idea could die until you figure out how to make the business plan work. And in this case, the book proposal is our business plan to a degree.
Yeah. I mean, you need to be able to, well, I mean, it's standard for proposals to include a marketing and publicity section, but when I'm appraising a proposal, most of the time I have a bit of a tendency to skim over that.
Mm-hmm.
And unless someone's really got it really badly wrong, because that's really the publisher's job to know that more than anything else. And in a way, that's probably that's possibly the least important part of the proposal, unless the author has connections they can use. If you can put that in, then that will help people in the media, people in the press that you can use. Mostly you're trying to sell yourself as a writer and your idea as a book. And that's the most important thing, that it's original, that it's going to be good, it's going to be readable, and that it will be commercial. That it will be commercial at whatever level is something the publisher will judge, and they will tend to judge instantly. And your best place, as a prospective author, you're relying to a great extent on publishers already wanting the subject before they've even seen your proposal. Commissioning editors have a set. Each year, each part of the year, they will tend to have their list of things that they would like to see books on.
Mm-hmm.
what they're really hoping will come through. And if your book is one of those, that's how you stand. That's when you stand the best chance of being taken on. They tend to be less likely to take books that they're not already looking for. Something has to be really special. It doesn't matter how well written you think your book is, or how important you think it is, or you think that there will be people interested in reading it. A publisher has to be absolutely blown away by it. So they absolutely love and adore, and they're incredibly excited by.
Right. Which is part of the reason why the boy who followed his father into Auschwitz found the right spot with the UK Penguin editor, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, in both cases, really, because as I said, with the original the indie publisher in Chicago, because the commissioning editor had a personal connection, and with Penguin in the UK, it was because Dan Bunyard, his name is the editor there, is kind of is one of those editors who has a fairly free hand to decide what books they want to publish and really focus entirely on that, not taking really random submissions.
Yeah.
And he devoted 5 years of his career at one point to persuading Tom Jones to write an autobiography, and eventually it was done. And there was a few years ago, he decided he wanted to publish a really good Holocaust book. He was convinced the time was right to have a Holocaust bestseller.
Yeah.
And he went looking for subjects. He went around agents he knew. As I say, he has a particularly good relationship with my agent, and my agent happened to have my book to hand. And that was the one he picked. I had to make some changes. The original Chicago.
I was going to ask you that.
It was titled The Stone Crusher. It was Dan's idea to immediately change the title to The Boy Who Followed His Father into Auschwitz, because he recognized immediately that was the core, that was the emotional core of the story. But he also,
and it's also such a big conflict. I mean, I immediately, just the title, you're like, what, why, how?
Yeah. And also the original version of The Stone Crusher was a little bit longer. It was a bit more detailed. It was about 20,000 words longer, if I remember rightly. It needed to be pruned down. There was a certain amount of repetition in it that I had to cut out. There's still that niggling overwriting. There was a bit of that still after 18, 19 years or whatever it was then. I was still had a bit of a tendency to do that. And that was it really, just improving it, which involved cutting it down, trimming it down to a really lean story. There was no surplus material in there, just completely pared down and simple and elegant. And that was all I had to do. And it took me a month to do that.
Really?
Because I by that point I grasped exactly what he wanted from it, exactly what he thought was needed to be done to the Stone Crusher to turn it into The Boy Who Followed. And we were so exactly on the same wavelength, what needed to be done. I just got straight in there and just did it.
Wow.
There was no trial and error. We both knew exactly what needed to be altered.
That's amazing, because most people that I talk to, when they find that they need to cut tens of thousands of words, and 20,000 is not a small amount of words, usually there's a certain amount of I don't know where to start. So that's awesome that you and the editor are on the same page.
Well, he was amazed that he and the editor he also brought in to help with it, where they were both astonished that I did do it first go, because most authors, well, me included, wouldn't necessarily get it right first time.
Yeah.
It was just with that particular story, that particular book, we just knew exactly what was needed.
Yeah.
And I mean, the end result is, as I think so far as close as I've ever come to writing, a perfectly done book.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it is perfect. I'm saying, but it's as close as I think I've ever come.
Yeah. As a
I'm
writer,
so pleased with it.
Right. I totally get that feeling of, I still tell people that I I hope that until I die and there are no more books, that I know that every book can't be better than the last. But if every couple of books can be the best book of all of them so far, then it just makes me really happy. And I haven't read your other books, but this one is just stunning. I am in love with it as much as I also just, I can't read it at night before I go to sleep because I'm afraid I'm going to have terrible dreams. But it's so well written that, like I said, I keep forgetting the time and realizing I'm late for something, which is, I think, one of my best compliments to a book.
Well, what I tried to do when I was writing, so I thought a lot before I even began about how I would write it. At one point, I didn't think I was going to have enough source material, so I considered writing it as fiction.
Yeah.
Fiction based on a true story. But then as I did the research, it all fell into place. And I had more than enough to make it completely factual. I didn't have to make anything up.
Yeah.
But I always had to make a decision about style. And of course, I've been reading things like Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel, those survivor narratives. Right. And the thing that they have in common, like they do with war men, combat veterans, war memoirs, is a simplicity of style. They just let the material speak for the source material speak for itself in a way. They just tell you what happened.
Yeah.
And I tried to emulate that. I tried not to get that's what helped combat the overwriting. I didn't take things too far. I tried to keep things relatively simple.
Yeah.
And try to keep myself in the right frame of mind for it, because it wasn't easy to write some of it. It was, emotionally, it was quite tough.
Yeah.
And I would listen to certain like modernist music to get in the right frame of mind for describing Auschwitz, for example. There's a piece called by the composer Penderecki, Polish composer, called Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, a modernist piece.
Wow.
Which is really difficult to listen to, sort of crashing, dissonant orchestral music. And I listened to that as part of a way of getting into that emotional frame where I could write about Auschwitz.
Wow.
It was quite tough to do.
Yeah. And that would affect the rest of your daily life, your nights, your weekends, and
yeah, I'm the hardest part to write was the fate of Tini and Herta. And then we're dealing with Kurt Kleinman, the last surviving member of the family. I eventually sent him the finished manuscript to read, and that was hard because I knew that I found out things that he hadn't known, and that possibly even Fritz and Gustav themselves hadn't known, including the details of what happened to Tini and Herta. And Kurt obviously knew that his mother and his sister had been murdered by the Nazis in the East, near Minsk. And he and his wife had even been there in the 1990s to where there's a monument at the site of that camp. But he knew nothing about the detail, the horrible, horrible details of how they died. So reading my book I knew would be the first he would hear of that. And so sending him that manuscript, I felt almost as if I was sending him a ticking bomb. And he later said that he found it devastating, and he broke down. When he read that, I find it quite difficult to talk about now.
Yeah.
At the same time, he was glad to know it. He had always wanted to know. All his life had read everything he could get his hands on about the Holocaust, wanting to understand what happened to his family. And he was glad to know what had happened to them, with these things that he hadn't known about.
Yeah.
And also Edith, the eldest daughter of the family, who was a refugee in England during the war. Her son is still around, and I interviewed him. He had no idea that his father had been interned in a British camp during the war before.
Wow.
So they clearly they didn't talk about it that much.
Yeah.
So the younger generation of the family also were finding out a lot about this story for the first time reading this book. Because they apparently avoided talking about it that much.
Yeah.
And this is partly due to differences between Kurt and Fritz. After the war was over, and Kurt, having grown up in America, ended up doing his military service in the US Army, and ended up eventually back in Vienna, visiting, and he visited his father and brother, Gustav and Fritz, for the first time since he had left. And he'd been in touch with them during that time, but they hadn't met. And he and Fritz had been, as children in Vienna, they had been extremely close, best friends, but they had grown up. And Kurt, having grown up in America, he'd adopted American values, but his brother in the camps had become a communist. The communist and socialist political prisoners had helped the Jews to survive in the camps. Yeah. So they just did not see eye to eye politically. And so Gustav ruled no politics in the house. Yeah. And the result of that, to Kurt's lifelong regret, is that they didn't talk about what had happened in the camps. And so I don't think Kurt ever really talked to his father about it, didn't talk to his brother all that much about it until many, many years later.
Yeah.
So it's partly, I feel, that apart from anything else, I've helped this family to, uncover this incredible story. I don't think many of them knew just quite how amazing their family was.
Yeah.
Many Jewish families have incredible Holocaust family stories, and they're all amazing in their own way. But this one, as far as I'm aware, is just unique. The story of Gustav and Fritz, there's nothing like it.
Jeremy, the tagline for all of my writing programs, classes, the podcast is "Write a book, change the world," and it's because I really, really, really believe it. Okay, now I can feel myself starting to cry. I really, I try to help the writers that I talk to or students that I have to understand that if you positively impact one person's life, that is worth the time and energy you put into that book. If you positively impact more and more and more people, then it's even more. I think that the time and the toil and the tears and the heartbreak to write a book like this, or the joy and laughter and tears to write romantic comedies that I write, there's a purpose and a reason for books, and that's like a whole nother topic that I could go on and on about. But the ridiculousness of people choosing to believe that most of this never happened and that it was all made up. And I wonder how much of it comes because it's too painful for people who went through it to have wanted to talk about it afterwards. I don't know where the ridiculous ideas come from, but I'm so, so happy that people like you and your publishers, choose to continue to put work like this out, and in a way that will affect the reader in their heart. It's not just reading. I mean, academic books are great for what they're for, but books like this affect people's hearts. And I think that it's important. Who said the famous phrase, if we forget our history, we'll just repeat it. And that's, not the exact wording, and I'm so pleased that you are able to bring like the family, the love, the heartbreak, the things that are so personal, the things that really affect us as human beings and that we can all relate to on some level in our own lives. I'm so glad that you wrote the book, that they published the book, and I'm thrilled to pieces. I had no idea it had gone to #1 right away in the UK. I just read the information about being on the bestseller list in Canada. I hope that it continues to do incredibly well. And for everybody who's listening going, my goodness, I really need to try this book. Yeah, you do. And have some Kleenex nearby. Also, I really want to let people know this is, well, it's one of the best/most footnoted narrative nonfiction pieces that I've read. But this is the first time where I have clicked on every single footnote. Some of them are, IBID kind of stuff, just letting us know where you got the information. But you've got so many footnotes that have 1 or 2 extra sentences explaining what happened that I'm like, okay, I have to read every footnote just to get even more of the information.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the strategies I've used to cope with overwriting, is that when I get those is kind of the beauty of doing narrative nonfiction, is that when I get those extra details that need to be cut out of the main narrative, often I can just shunt them off into a note.
Right.
So they're still there for somebody to read, but they're not clogging up the main narrative.
Yeah, you can take out a whole paragraph and just add the sentence. Jeremy, I would love to talk to you more about this, but we've already been talking for an hour, and I fear that my listeners sometimes are like, oh man, this went so fast, but I'm still on the treadmill. I really am tired and need to stop exercising. Thank you so much. Please tell us, where can listeners find you and your books online, or where else that we can find books right now?
Well, I'm at jeremydronfield.com, and you can always find my books on Amazon or wherever you get books from.
Excellent.
They're right there.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing all your experiences with us, and also for your book. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you for having me.